about this before we leave tonight, but I didn't want to get in the middle of a prayer and make my wife go, oh. But my cousin, Brian Johnson, he's probably about mid-30s.
Yeah.
Yeah. Brian is EMS guy and a forest ranger guy, handyman guy and a tractor guy, farm guy. He was out fertilizing the field yesterday or 2 days ago with a tractor and a spreader. The gearbox of the tractor got hung up. He thought it'd be a good idea to just whack it loose with a hammer. All the bearings exploded into him as it was almost like getting shot with a gun. So he had to go to E hospital. They had to do surgery. One of the bearings went in so far they couldn't get it.
Oh, wow.
He's gonna make a full recovery.
Where,
Outside of Hollins, Alabama.
where did it hit him?
Midsection.
That's good.
Yeah, I mean, it's as good as, there's no great place for that to happen, but that could have been,
His face, yeah.
obviously that could have been a lot worse, but that was the text that was going on with Jeff and Stephanie this morning, my brother and sister, so. Yeah. So, never a dull moment in the metropolis of Hollins, Alabama. A land where there's more cattle than humans. We all go through seasons where we need advice. We've probably been through seasons where someone needed our advice. When major decisions come, it's common for us to seek the counsel of others, at least we should. Tell me, who are some of your go-to people for advice?
Surely.
Sure.
I don't even have to ask, she just gives it.
You're gonna get it no matter what. You're gonna get it too for. Spouse is a lot of times first place for those of us who are married, first place we go. Okay. Who else, either by relationship or just a specific name?
Well, you,
Okay. Thank you.
and I think of my sister.
Okay.
Casey's got one.
Casey. Parents. My dad is 83 years old. I still go to him for advice. It's not much he hadn't seen. Yeah, for sure. We've all got those people. Now, when we go to these people and we lay out a situation, sometimes we give them everything we can. Sometimes we may not give all the information. But once they give advice, then we have to make a determination, is this good advice or is this bad advice in this specific situation? Do you have any type of filters that you run advice through to help you determine, is somebody really advising me well here or are they not? Do you have any filters you run that through to help you make that determination?
Scripture.
Scripture, prayer.
Yep.
Okay. Those are about the best answers you can give in a Bible class, aren't they? For sure. Okay.
Your conscience.
All right. The conscience, for sure. For sure. That's very helpful. And particularly a God-trained conscience, not a conscience that's been seared, but absolutely. Okay. Tonight, we're going to be looking at 2 or 3 different sets of advice. And what we're going to try to figure out is, was the advice given in this situation, was it good advice or was it bad advice? And
Mike, one thing I typically, or not typically, the things that I think about are advice. Is this based upon prior experience or just opinion?
Yeah, that matters a lot. That matters an awful lot. Has this person been through this situation before? Or had they been involved in it in some way? That can make a big difference. Okay, so let's see what we can learn. Second Samuel chapter 16. We're going to start off in 15 through 23. This will be our first instance of advice. I think we're going to see 3 tonight. I'm not certain of that. We'll see how it depends on how time goes. One of y'all read for me 15 through 23. All right, Jim, thank you.
Meanwhile, Absalom and all the men of Israel came to Jerusalem, and Ahithophel was with him. Then Hushai, the Archite, David's confidant, went to Absalom and said to him, "Live long the king, live long the king." Absalom said to Hushai, "So this is the love you show for your friend? If he's your friend, why didn't you go with him?" Hushai said to Absalom, "No, the one chosen by the Lord, by these people, and by all the men of Israel. His I will be, and I will remain with him. Furthermore, whom shall I serve? Should I not serve the son, just as I served your father, so I will serve you?" Absalom said to Ahithophel, "Give us your advice. What should we do?" Ahithophel answered, "Sleep with your father's concubines, whom he left to take care of the palace. Then all Israel will hear that you have made yourself obnoxious to your father, and the hands of everyone with you will be more resolute." So they pitched a tent for Absalom on the roof, and he slept with his father's concubines in the sight of all Israel. Now in those days, the advice of Ahithophel gave was like that of one who inquires of God. That was how both David and Absalom regarded all of Ahithophel's advice.
Okay, I don't think any of y'all have ever gotten advice exactly like that before.
Nope.
I would certainly hope not. Let's start with Ahithophel. Who is this guy? You all remember from last week who this is?
David's counselor.
He was in David's council. He was one of David's inside guys.
Okay.
We find in chapter 15 that Absalom, as he is setting up his rebellion, he calls for Ahithophel, and Ahithophel is more than happy to oblige and go along with Absalom. So David has sought his counsel probably for years and years by this time, but Ahithophel has now hit the ground and is out of there. Remember, he is the grandfather of Bathsheba. So as the grandfather of Bathsheba, there may be a little extra reason that he would be more than happy to leave David's side when the opportunity presented itself. Now, do y'all remember the end of John when John says, if I tried to write down everything Jesus said or did, we couldn't put it in a book. There's just too much. I would almost guarantee you there's more here than what we have. We've got the main points to help us understand why things happen the way that they happen. But if Ahithophel leaves David to go to Absalom, there's no way that Ahithophel is not involved in part in the further planning of this revolt. That's in large part why he's there, because he's the one that supposedly gives good advice. Now, who is Hushai? Whose friend is he?
David's.
Yes, and he still is David's friend in spite of what you just read. Because remember from last week that Hushai goes to David and says, "I'm going to go with you. Wherever you go, I'm going to go." And David says, "No, I need you to stay in the palace, and I need you to frustrate Ahithophel's advice. If Ahithophel says turn right, no, you say no, turn left. You just do whatever it takes to try to frustrate Ahithophel's advice." So he really is David's friend, even though he's feigning something else here. Now, It says in verse 20 that Absalom says to Ahithophel, give us your advice. Why doesn't he ask for Hushai's advice?
He's grandpa.
Okay. At this point, yeah, not yet. So he's not going to add. There's got to be a little more time here. Absalom, when he shows up and he says, "I'm going to follow you," it's like, okay, but let's see. But Ahithophel has been helping him plan the revolt. Now, we're about to find that Hushai's advice isn't going to be sought here in just a little while. So here is Ahithophel. Now remember, it says in verse 23, when he gave advice, it's like that of one who inquires of God. That's high praise, isn't it? Man, that's high praise. So what is this guy's advice? He says, sleep with your father's concubines. All right. Now, here's a fun question to ask in a Wednesday night Christian Bible class. Is that good advice or bad advice?
That would be bad.
It's awful.
Okay. All right. Now, the effect of this is that David is going to be put to shame and disgrace. The relationship between David and Absalom is going to be further broken. The entire harem is now going to understand that Absalom has taken over as king. Absalom's supporters are now basically going to have to man up because there's no turning back once this happens. If you're in for Absalom and once this happens, it's not like you can switch sides now. And by the end of this chapter, Jerusalem is in the firm grip of Absalom. Here's my point. Militarily and politically, this advice looks spot on. But we know it's horrible advice. Which leads us to, and by the way, we haven't even talked about the fact that this advice is in part opening the door for Nathan's prophecy to be fulfilled all the way back in chapter 12 when Nathan said this is going to be part of your punishment. Not this specific act, but in general terms basically described about what was about to happen. So even Nathan's prophecy is fulfilled. The message I wanted to see in this is just advising one. I know this is a duh statement, but it kind of helps us understand a couple of things later. Advising someone to sin is never good advice, even if it works. Does that make sense? But because sometimes on this side of eternity and for short term, sometimes doing the wrong thing pragmatically works. For at least for a short period of time. But for that advice, maybe this doesn't do it to y'all, but just the idea of giving that advice, him following that advice, and then in verse 23, it says his advice was like the one of who inquires of God. That just kind of, I don't think so. But I just find that to be an interesting two passages to be side by side. All right, so Ahithophel is not quite through. He's got some more advice as we get here into chapter 17. I'm just going to read chapter 17, then we're going to pick our way through it. Well, first 23 verses of it anyway. So Ahithophel said to Absalom, I would choose 12,000 men and set out tonight in pursuit of David. I would attack him while he's weary and weak. I would strike him with terror, and then all the people with him will flee, and I will strike down only the king, and will bring all the people back to you. The death of the man you seek will mean the return of all. All the people will be unharmed. This plan, very important in verse 4, this plan seemed good to Absalom. You will also notice that this plan seemed good to all the elders of Israel. This looks like a good plan, and it seems to be pleasing to everyone in the room. But Absalom says, summon also Hushai the Archite, so we can hear what he has to say as well. So when Hushai came to him, Absalom says, Ahithophel has given us this advice. Should we do what he says? If not, give us your advice. Give us your opinion. Hushai replied to Absalom, the advice Ahithophel has given you is not good this time. You know your father and his men, they are fighters, as fierce as a wild bear robbed of her cubs. Besides, your father is an experienced fighter. He'll not spend the night with the troops. Even now, he's sitting in a cave or some other place. If he should attack your troops first, whoever hears about it will say there's been a slaughter among the troops who follow Absalom. Then even the bravest soldier, whose heart is like the heart of a lion, will melt with fear, for all of Israel knows that your father is a fighter and those who are with him are brave. So I advise you, let all of Israel from Dan to Beersheba, as numerous as the sand on the seashore, be gathered to you, with yourself leading them into battle. Then we will attack him wherever he may be found, and we will fall on him as dew settles on the ground. Neither he nor any of his men will be left alive. If he withdraws into the city, all of Israel will bring ropes to that city, will drag it down into the valley until not as much as a pebble is left. So Absalom and all the men of Israel said, well, the advice of Hushai the Archite is better than that of Ahithophel. For the Lord had determined to frustrate the, what kind of advice?
Good advice.
Good advice of Ahithophel in order to bring disaster on Absalom. Hushai told Zadok and Abiathar the priest, Ahithophel has advised Absalom and the elders of Israel to do such and such. I advise them to do so and so. That's funny to me. Thus and thus as opposed to so and so.
Yeah.
Now send a message at once and tell David, do not spend the night at the fords in the wilderness. Cross over without fail, or the king and all the people with him will be swallowed up. Jonathan and Ahimaaz were staying at En-Rogel. A female servant was to go and inform them, and they were to go and tell King David, for they could not risk being seen entering the city. A young man saw them, told Absalom. The two of them left at once, went into the house of a man in Bahurim. He had a well in his courtyard. They climbed down into the well. His wife took a covering, spread it out over the opening of the well, scattered grain over it. No one knew anything about it. Apparently, the writer of this knew something about it. When Absalom's men came to the woman at the house, they said, where are Ahimaaz and Jonathan? The woman said, they crossed over the brook. The men searched but found no one. They returned to Jerusalem. After they had gone, verse 21, the two men climbed out of the well, went to inform King David. They said, set out and cross the river at once. Ahithophel has advised such and such against you. So David and all the people with him set out, crossed the Jordan. By daybreak, no one was left who had not crossed the Jordan. When Ahithophel saw that his advice had not been followed, he saddled his donkey, set for his house in his hometown. He put his house in order, and then he hung himself. He died and was buried in his father's tomb. All right, so let's go back to the beginning of the chapter. Is this good advice or bad advice that Ahithophel gives?
Bad.
It's described as good.
Yeah. So it's bad and it's good
A little bit of both.
because it's described as good advice.
Casey.
I'm sorry?
Why
Casey. Yeah, thank you.
was David ever weak and weary? Yeah. When was David ever weak and weary?
That's a good question. Sometimes the Psalms write about he seems to have moments when he feels weak and weary. We're about to see in the beginning of chapter 18 that there's nothing weak and weary about him in this moment. He's ready to kick and fight. And we're going to see that in just a minute. That's a good point. Now, we're never going to know in the extent that his advice wasn't followed. But the advice to strike before David can mobilize, to use enough force to scare his people and limit casualties on a lot of levels, that sounds like good advice. In particular, limiting casualties. That I would hope that would resonate with all of us, if you can do that. Now, Casey just made a very good point. You ever known David to be weary? And based on 2 Kings 23, I've never known David's men to be frightened.
Right.
Sometimes if they're going to be too much, it's the other way, not terror. But so Ahithophel gives advice that it looks good. It looks so good that Absalom and all the elders think it's good advice. But now why is Absalom suddenly interested in the advice of Hushai when he wasn't before? Because the end of chapter 16, Hushai's right there. He doesn't ask for his advice. This time he does. Yeah, I don't know either.
Can't afford a mistake.
Yeah. Now, Proverbs in several places says, victory is won with many advisors. My guess, underlying guess, is that Absalom is probably hoping that Ahithophel's advice will be somewhat validated by Hushai. Because if you get a lot of voices telling you the same thing, especially in that moment, and you're right, this is a big decision. Because if you play this wrong, and he did play it wrong, disaster is going to happen.
Maybe he's also thinking that, he's dad's buddy. Maybe he'll slip up and say something that gives David's position away or his setup or, whatever.
That is true.
An edge.
That is true. What if Hushai had let something slip? That's a good point. That's a real good point. So Hushai's advice is, Absalom, you need to understand who your father is. This goes back to something Casey said just a moment ago. Understand the vulnerability of your own fighters. And then the other thing Hushai basically says is slow down. Slow down, prepare an overwhelming force, take David out that way. Now, is Hushai's advice good advice or bad advice?
Good for David, bad for Absalom.
Depends on who for. She thought it was bad advice, Trey?
Intentionally bad.
Okay, yeah, intentionally bad advice. Good point. Very good point. It's bad in that it doesn't work. It's good in that it accomplishes God's purpose. It's good in that Hushai does what David asked him to do, because David said frustrate him any way you can frustrate him. So he does. It's good and bad. In verse 11, he says, I advise you, let all Israel from Dan to Beersheba, as numerous as the sand on the seashores, be gathered to you, with you yourself leading the battle. That's a play to Absalom's ego big time. And that's good and bad because it works, but Absalom has a horrible ego, right? As we'll see later when he built a monument to himself. It's also good in that it slows down everything long enough that David can get across the Transjordan. And this basically stretches everything out and provides David the time he needs to get across, get prepared to fight. So sometimes figuring out the good and the bad is not always the easiest thing to do. Now Ahithophel recognizes that his advice, he's sure it's good advice, it's not followed. So he does what all of you guys do when your children don't take your advice, you go out and you kill yourself, right? That seems a little extreme.
Right.
He does know this, though. Well, he suspects this. He suspects that his advice is better than Hushai's, which means at this point, he cannot win. Because now that the king has chosen to follow Hushai's advice, one or two things is going to happen. Either his advice is going to be followed and it works, and Hushai is going to be the advisor from now on, and Ahithophel is not going to have any influence whatsoever, or this advice isn't going to work. David is going to return to the throne, and Ahithophel is going to be a traitor and be executed. So he is, from that standpoint, in between a rock and a hard place. It's obviously a horrible choice to make when you're caught between a rock and a hard place, though. But that's what Ahithophel does, which makes you wonder how all of his advice could be so wonderful up to this point. And he would think in his own life the best thing to do in this point is to kill himself. So David went to Mahanaim, and Absalom crossed the Jordan with all the men of Israel. Absalom had appointed Amasa over the army in the place of Joab. Amasa was the son of Jether, an Ishmaelite, who had married Abigail, the daughter of Nahash, the sister of Zeruiah, the mother of Joab. The Israelites and Absalom camped in the land of Gilead. So when David came to Mahanaim, Shobai the son of Nahash from Rabbah, the Ammonites, Machir the son of Amiel and Lodabar, and Barzeel the Gileadite from Rogelim, brought bedding and bowls and articles of pottery. We read all of that last week about these friends of David coming at a big time. In chapter 18, David mustered the men who were with him. He appointed commanders of thousands, commanders of hundreds. David sent out the troops, a third under his command, under the command of Joab, rather, a third under Abishai, a third under Ittai the Gittite, who showed up as one of his friends a week ago. And the king told the troops, "Hey, I'm going to go out with you." The men said, "You better not. If we're forced to flee, they don't care about us. Even if half of us die, they won't care. But you're worth 10,000 to us. It'd be better now for you to go give support from the city." By the way, I think Bill pointed out last week that for all of David's personal failings that we've read the last 3 or 4 weeks and his family interaction failings, when it was time to do a military operation, he was on his game. And here he's back on his game fully. The king answered, "I will do whatever seems best." So the king stood beside the gate while all of his men marched out in units of hundreds and thousands. That's a big army, by the way. The king commanded Joab, Abishai, and Ittai, "Be gentle with the young man Absalom." And all the troops heard the king giving orders concerning Absalom to each of the commanders. David's army marched out of the city to fight Israel, and the battle took place in the forest of Ephraim. Israel's troops were routed by David's men. That's a complicated passage. And the casualties were great, 20,000 men. Battle spread out over the whole countryside. The forest swallowed up more men that day than the sword. Absalom happened to meet David's men. He's riding his mule. By the way, why is he riding a mule?
You're the king.
He's the king. He's showing kingship. That's a sign of royalty.
Okay.
And as the mule went under the thick branches of a large oak, Absalom's hair got caught in the tree. He was left hanging in midair. Do y'all remember what the text a couple of chapters ago had talked about how crazy his hair was, long and thick and heavy and all that sort of stuff? Well, his hair got caught in the tree. He was left hanging in midair while the mule he was riding kept on going. When one of the men saw what had happened, he told Joab, "I just saw Absalom hanging in an oak tree." Joab said, "You saw him? Why didn't you kill him? I would have given you 10 shekels of silver and a warrior's belt." The man replied, even 1,000 shekels were weighed out in my hands. I wouldn't lay a hand on the king's son. In our hearing, the king commanded you and Abishai and Ittai protect the young man for my sake. And if I'd put my life in jeopardy and nothing is hidden from the king, you'd have just shut up about it. So Joab said, I'm not going to wait for like this for you. So he took 3 javelins in his hand, plunged them into Absalom's heart while Absalom was still alive in the oak tree. 10 of Joab's armor bearers surrounded Absalom, struck him, and he killed him. I don't know why 3 javelins didn't do the job.
Right. 10 more.
Yeah, 10 more. Joab sounded the trumpet. All the troops started pursuing Israel, for Joab halted them. They took Absalom, threw him in a big pit in the forest, piled up a large heap of rocks over him. Interesting, in verse 18, during his lifetime, Absalom had taken a pillar and erected it in the king's valley as a monument to himself, for he thought, I have no son to carry on the memory of my name. So he named that pillar after himself, and it is called Absalom's monument to this day. So why is David telling them to be gentle with his son Absalom? After all Absalom has done to Israel and after all Absalom has done to him, David says to Ittai, to Abishai, and to Joab in the full hearing of the army as they're going out, go easy on my son. Why does David do that?
He loves him.
He still loves his son. Messed up.
Chance for mercy.
I'm sorry?
Maybe a chance for mercy.
Absolutely a chance for mercy. For all of this mess, he still loves his son. I would imagine he's still got a little guilt going on, but primarily just the love of his son. Now, 20,000 people died, including Absalom, his own son. So that gives you an idea of how many lives have been lost that can be traced all the way back to David's sin with Bathsheba. Because all of this started spinning out of control at that point. 20,000 lives. Now, when Joab sees Absalom, Joab has been specifically told by David, go easy on my son. I don't think Joab went easy on Absalom. Why not? David told him to. He directly disobeyed the king, which he could have been killed for, by the way. He wasn't, obviously. How does Joab see Absalom?
Continuing problem.
Problem.
As a problem, for sure. As a threat, as a problem, as an enemy. Absalom believes, or David, come on, Mike. Joab believes Absalom has to die for the good of Israel and for the peace of Israel. Because once Absalom's dead, all this fighting can stop. So, is Joab's direct disobedience to David a good thing or a bad thing?
Probably.
Politically speaking, I guess it's good.
Yeah, that's a hard one because go ahead.
It's a good thing, and I think Joab was willing to die for it.
Okay, that's a very good point. Joab's putting his own neck on the line. So he believes it's a good thing so much that he's willing to put his very life on the line for it. So none of us want to say killing another human being was a good move. At the same time, what this does end the battle. Who's online?
Casey.
Casey.
That's a bad thing. Because David it's like a man with God's heart, and Joab doesn't have God's heart. David does.
Now, that's a really good point because David is a man after God's own heart. It is obvious through all of 2 Samuel that Joab is shrewd and his heart is very much with Israel, but we don't necessarily see Joab's heart with God. Now, the man who is in verse 11 and 12 is not about to kill Absalom because he knows if he kills Absalom, Joab's got no problem throwing him under the bus. So he knows he's in a double bind in verse 13 and 14. By the way, you will not at all be surprised to know that Absalom's monument that's mentioned here in chapter 18, verse 18, disappeared. Now, what is there is something that was built during either the Hellenistic or earliest Roman period. So there is something in the Kidron Valley east of Jerusalem that's some type of monument that marks Absalom's existence, but it's not at all what he designated for himself. Let's see if we can finish the drill here. Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said, "Let me run, take the news to the king, that the Lord has vindicated him by delivering him from his hand." "You're not going to do that," Joab told him. Joab's trying to save his neck. "You may take the news another time. You better not do it today because the king's son is dead." Joab said to a Cushite, "Hey, you go tell him." Cushite bowed before Joab and ran off. Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, again said, "Come what may, please let me run behind the Cushite." Joab said, "My son, why do you want to go? You don't have any news that'll bring you a reward." Joab's giving this man good advice. He said, "Come what may, I want to run." So Joab said, "All right, run." Ahimaaz ran by the way of the plain, outran the Cushite. While David was sitting between the inner and outer gates, the watchman went up to the roof of the gateway by the wall. As he looked out, he saw a man running alone. The watchman called out to the king, reported it. King said, "If he's alone, he's got to have good news." Runner came closer and closer. Watchman saw another runner, not running alone, another man running alone. "He must be bringing good news too." Watchman said, "It seems to me that the first one runs like Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok." "He's a good man," the king said. "He comes with good news." Ahimaaz called out to the king, "All is well." He bowed down before the king with his face to the ground, said, "Praise be to the Lord your God. He has delivered up those who lifted their hands against my lord the king." The first question out of his mouth, "Is the young man Absalom safe?" There's a lot of questions David could have just asked. How are my men? How are their troops? There's a lot of things he could have asked. Is the young man Absalom safe is his question. "I saw great confusion." Ahimaaz apparently is wiser than I first thought. "I saw great confusion just as Joab was about to send the king's servant and me, but I don't know what it was." He knows what it was, by the way. He's wise not to say. The king said, "Stand aside and wait here." He stood aside and stood there. The Cushite arrived and said, "My lord the king, hear the good news. The Lord has vindicated you today by delivering you from the hand of all who rose up against you." King asked the Cushite the same question. "Is the young man Absalom safe?" The Cushite replied, "May the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up to harm you be like that young man." The king was shaken. He went up to the room over the gateway and wept. He said, my son Absalom, if only I had died instead of you. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son." There is an incredible song written about 2 Samuel 18:32 through 34 that catches the passion of that moment. Sending chill bumps down your spine. I wish I could remember the name of it. David is obviously incredibly distraught, maybe because he feels responsible, maybe just because of the love of his son, maybe because, hey, I told these guys to go easy on my son and they did not go easy on my son. So there's a little bit of not only the incredible sorrow, but even a little bit of anger, I'm sure, about that. David never asked about how many of his own men were killed. All he asked about is Absalom. So now there's one more piece of advice before we go. Joab was told, the king is weeping and mourning for Absalom. And for the whole army, the victory that day was turned into mourning, because on that day the troops heard it said, the king is grieving for his son. The men stole into the city that day as men steal into who are shamed when they flee from battle. The king covered his face and cried out, oh, my son Absalom, oh, Absalom, my son, my son. Joab went into the house of the king and said, today you have humiliated all your men who have just saved your life and the lives of your sons and daughters and the lives of your wives and concubines. You love those who hate you. You hate those who love you. You made it clear today that the commanders and their men mean nothing to you. I see that you'd be pleased if Absalom were alive today and all of us were dead. Now go out and encourage your men. I swear by the Lord that if you don't go out, and not a man will be left with you by nightfall. This will be worse than all the calamities that have come from your youth till now. So the king got up, took his seat in the gateway. The men were told the king is sitting in the gateway. They all came before him. The Israelites had fled to their home. From that point forward, David is going to go through a far too long process to end up fully back on the throne. This is my last question. Did Joab in this passage give good advice or bad advice?
Good
This
advice.
this is really good advice.
Yes.
You got to get up and get going again. For you to act like you love those who hate you and hate those who love you and your officers mean nothing to you, you got to get up and get going. I imagine that seemed cold. I imagine it seemed unsympathetic, but it was also incredibly wise.
Yes. Yes.
And sometimes wise advice might seem cold and it might not seem particularly as sympathetic as we would like. But in this case, it's very wise advice. All right. Next week, we will have an abbreviated class at 7:30-ish. We will adjourn and go into the foyer where we will get to experience a Bible living museum as displayed by our children. So we look forward to their expertise. We will get to roam through the foyer as they tell us all about who they are and all about their era. So that's going to be really, really cool. So we'll start in here, and then when Kathy says they're ready, around 7:30, we'll go down toward the foyer. We'll have a really good time with that. The kids have really worked hard on this the last few weeks. So I'm seeing this is going to be a lot of fun. Trace, you okay praying us out of here?
Absolutely. Dear God, your word is so awesome, and we are so thankful for a chance to meet together in this great nation and to learn more about your word freely. Help us to continue to think upon you and your words and the advice through your Bible that you give us. Be with us the rest of this week and continue to lift those that are sick and ill and those that are needing your comfort. And forgive us for our sins. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
All right, guys, thank you. Thank you carefully and safely. Thank you, everybody that jumped on online. We sure do appreciate all of you. Great.